Would you bet a baby's life for $500? In 1943, an SS soldier laughed and declared, "No one has ever saved a baby from LEBENSBORN, and no one ever will." He bet $500 on it. But on the other side of the kitchen, a simple woman, a cook no one noticed, began to put together a dangerous plan, using only bread baskets. What she did changed 17 destinies and left the Nazis furious. Would you have the courage to do the same? Subscribe and tell me in the comments, would you bet your own life for a stranger? The LEBENSBORN Center in Linz was known for its brutal discipline and constant surveillance. The grey stone building stood like a fortress in the Austrian countryside, its walls thick and cold, designed to keep secrets inside. SS guards watched every corner. Hallways, kitchens, nurseries, exits. Their boots echoed through the corridors at all hours, a rhythm everyone had learned to fear. No baby had ever escaped, not one. The system was considered unbeatable. The racial doctrine was rigid. The babies were property of the Reich. They were measured, categorized, and assigned based on their features. Blonde hair and blue eyes meant a future with a loyal German family. Anything less meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in the Reich often meant disappearance. Mothers who asked questions were removed. Mothers who cried too loud were sedated. Mothers who resisted were never seen again. Cooks, nurses, cleaners, all were watched and threatened. Fear was the invisible supervisor. Everyone knew the rules. Do your work, keep your head down, and never ever question what happened behind the locked doors on the 3rd floor. A nurse named Ingrid had been fired 2 months earlier for showing too much emotion during a separation. A janitor had vanished after asking about the Eastern Wing. The message was clear. Maria Kohler was the cook, a widow, childless, invisible to the eyes of the regime. She was 43 years old, with greying hair pulled into a tight bun and hands worn from years of scrubbing pots and kneading dough. She had been working at the center for nearly a year, and in that time she had perfected the art of being unnoticed. She prepared meals for the staff, baked bread for the mothers, and moved through the kitchen like a shadow. No one paid attention to her. That was exactly how she survived. On that same day, an arrogant SS soldier launched the bet during a conversation at dinner. His name was Oberscharführer Klaus Reinhardt, a tall man with a scar across his cheek and a reputation for cruelty. He was sitting at the staff table with 4 other officers, drinking schnapps and laughing about the futility of resistance. He said in a loud voice, $500 says not even God could get a baby out of here. His voice carried across the dining hall, confident and mocking. Some of the men laughed. Others swallowed hard, glancing around nervously. But Maria, standing near the kitchen door with a tray of bread in her hands, did not forget. She stood perfectly still, her face blank, but her mind was racing. She had heard stories, whispers among the cleaning staff. A mother who had begged to keep her child. A baby who had cried for 3 days straight before being taken away. But this open arrogance, this casual cruelty disguised as a joke, it was something else. It was a challenge, and it planted a seed in Maria's mind that she could not shake. That same evening, Maria saw a young mother crying in silence after giving birth. The woman was barely 20 years old, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had just delivered a healthy baby boy, but the nurses had already taken him from her arms. She sat alone in the recovery room, staring at the empty bassinet beside her bed, her hands trembling. Maria had brought her a bowl of soup, setting it down quietly on the bedside table. The mother looked up at her with hollow eyes and whispered, "They took him. They didn't even let me hold him." Maria said nothing. She couldn't. But something inside her broke. She walked back to the kitchen, her chest tight, her hands shaking. She set down the tray and gripped the edge of the counter, closing her eyes. And in that moment, an absurd idea began to grow. Dangerous, impossible, insane. But it would not leave her alone. Maria began to observe the guards' patterns, schedules, distractions, blind spots. She did this quietly, carefully, without changing her routine in any way that might draw attention. Every morning at 6, the night shift ended, and the day shift began. There was a 15-minute window during the handover, when the guards gathered near the main entrance to exchange reports. During that time, the kitchen entrance, located at the back of the building near the service road, was often unattended. She noticed other things too. The guards smoked in pairs near the east gate around 10 in the morning. They took their lunch break in rotations, which meant there were moments when only 2 men covered the entire ground floor. And on Thursdays, when the supply trucks arrived, there was chaos, noise, movement, boxes being unloaded, staff rushing to organize inventory. In all that confusion, a person could move almost unnoticed. In the kitchen, she tested the size of the bread baskets in silence. The large wicker baskets she used to carry fresh loaves to the dining hall were deep, nearly 2 feet, and sturdy. She lined one with a thick cotton cloth, folding it several times to create a soft cushion at the bottom. She placed a loaf of bread on top and carried it through the hallway, watching to see if anyone looked twice. No one did. The basket was ordinary, expected, invisible. She knew she couldn't save them all, but maybe 1, 2, maybe more. The thought terrified her, but it also gave her something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. She had lost her husband. She had no children. She had nothing left to lose except her life. And even that felt like a small price compared to the lives being stolen inside these walls. Maria began to talk discreetly with nurses who had doubts about the regime. She was careful, choosing her words like someone walking through a minefield. She started with Elsa, a young nurse from Vienna who sometimes cried in the storage room when she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, Maria brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her in silence. After a long pause, Elsa whispered, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep taking them away." Maria didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, letting the silence speak for her. A few days later, Elsa approached her in the hallway and said quietly, "3 babies have been marked for immediate relocation. They're scheduled to leave tomorrow morning." Maria felt her heart stop. "Tomorrow?" Elsa nodded, her eyes red. "I don't know where they're going. I just know they'll be gone." That night, Maria cried alone in her small room in the staff quarters. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands pressed against her face, her body shaking with silent sobs. She thought about the mother she had seen earlier that week. She thought about the babies who would disappear into a system designed to erase their identities, and she made a decision. She would try. The next morning, Maria prepared everything. She chose the deepest basket, the one she usually reserved for carrying multiple loaves at once. She lined it with a thick woolen blanket she had taken from the storage closet, folding it carefully to create a soft, insulated base. She placed several warm dinner rolls on top, arranging them to look natural. Then she hid small cloth diapers and a few strips of soft fabric beneath the blanket, just in case. Elsa met her in the hallway outside the nursery. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Room 3, she whispered. "The baby boy. He's alone right now." Maria's heart pounded so hard she thought it would break through her chest. She nodded once and walked toward the nursery with the basket in her arms, moving slowly, steadily, like she had done 1,000 times before. She pushed open the door to room 3. The baby was lying in a small metal crib, wrapped in a thin white blanket. He was awake, staring up at the ceiling with wide, unfocused eyes. Maria set the basket down on the floor and lifted the child carefully, cradling his head in her palm. He was warm and soft, impossibly small. She whispered, "Shh, little one, shh." She placed him gently into the basket, nestling him into the folds of the blanket. Then she covered him with the dinner rolls, arranging them in a loose pile that allowed air to pass through but concealed him completely. She picked up the basket and walked out of the room. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was shallow. Every step felt like it took an eternity. She walked down the hallway, past 2 nurses who didn't even glance at her, past a guard who was lighting a cigarette near the window. She reached the back entrance and pushed the door open with her shoulder. The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, just a whimper. Maria froze. At that exact moment, thunder rumbled across the sky, loud and sudden. The sound masked the baby's noise completely. She exhaled and kept walking. She carried the basket down the service road, past the supply shed, and into the small wooded area behind the center. 100 yards away there was a church, a simple stone building with a red door. Maria had arranged everything with the priest 2 days earlier, speaking in careful, vague terms. He had asked no questions. He simply nodded and said, "I will be ready." She left the baby in silence on the church steps, tucked inside the basket with the blanket wrapped tightly around him. She knocked 3 times on the door and walked away quickly, her heart pounding, her eyes blurred with tears. By the time she returned to the kitchen, the baby was gone, and no one understood how. Maria returned to work as if nothing had happened. She scrubbed the pots with the same rhythm as always, kneaded the dough with the same steady hands, and spoke to no one unless spoken to. The guard didn't even notice her absence. When the staff gathered for the evening meal, she served bread and soup with her usual efficiency, her face blank, her movements careful. Inside, her heart was still racing, but outside, she was invisible again. The next morning, there was confusion in the nursery. A nurse discovered the empty crib and immediately reported it to the supervisor. An investigation began, but it was half-hearted. The assumption was that there had been a clerical error. Perhaps the baby had already been transferred and the paperwork had been misplaced. It happened sometimes in the chaos of the center. No one suspected the cook. In the following week, Maria repeated the operation, a second baby. This time it was a girl, barely 3 days old, with soft brown hair and a quiet temperament. Elsa helped again, standing watch near the hallway, while Maria moved quickly and silently. The basket was prepared the same way, blanket, rolls hidden beneath the surface. Maria carried it out during the Thursday supply delivery, when the noise and activity provided perfect cover. She walked past 2 guards who were busy unloading crates, past a supervisor who was shouting orders, and out the back entrance without a single person looking her way. The baby didn't make a sound. Maria left her at the church, knocked 3 times, and disappeared back into the trees. The priest was waiting just as he had promised. By now the bet had become a joke among the soldiers. Oberscharführer Reinhardt still laughed about it during meals, mocking the very idea that anyone could outsmart the system. $500, he'd say, raising his glass. Still unclaimed, still impossible. The other officers would chuckle nervously, but no one dared to challenge him. The SS man was certain of his victory, and his arrogance grew with each passing day. But rumors began to circulate among the nuns and priests in the region. 2 babies had appeared at the church in less than 2 weeks, both healthy, both wrapped in woolen blankets, both left without explanation. The priest said nothing publicly, but he whispered to the Mother Superior at the convent, and she whispered to a doctor she trusted, and slowly, quietly, a network began to form. In 2 weeks, 5 babies had vanished without explanation. The center's administration was growing concerned. The commander, a stern man named Hauptsturmführer Werner Koch, convened a discreet inspection. He didn't want to alarm Berlin or suggest that the Lebensborn system had any weaknesses, but he also couldn't ignore the pattern. 5 missing infants in 14 days was not a clerical error. It was something else. Maria felt the pressure tightening around her. She noticed guards lingering in hallways where they hadn't been before. She saw the commander walking through the kitchen one afternoon, his eyes scanning everything with cold precision. She kept her head down, continued her work, and prayed that her luck would hold. But she didn't stop. The 6th baby was a boy, with blonde hair and blue eyes, exactly the kind the Reich prized most. Taking him was the greatest risk yet, because his disappearance would be noticed immediately. But Elsa came to her one evening and said, "They're sending him to Munich tomorrow, to a high-ranking family. If you're going to do something, it has to be tonight." Maria's hands trembled as she prepared the basket. She knew this could be the one that got her caught. She knew the guards would be more vigilant, but she also knew that if she didn't act, the boy would disappear into a life built on lies, raised to serve a regime that had stolen his identity. She moved quickly that night, during the shift change at 6 o'clock. The 15-minute window felt shorter than ever. She lifted the baby from his crib, wrapped him tightly, and placed him in the basket. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the guards would hear it. She walked down the hallway, past the main office, past 2 officers who were deep in conversation. She reached the back door and stepped outside. The cold air hit her face like a slap. She walked faster now, almost running, the basket heavy in her arms. She reached the church, left the baby on the steps, and knocked. This time the priest opened the door immediately. He looked at her with sad, knowing eyes and said, "God will remember this." Maria didn't reply. She turned and walked back into the darkness. By the end of the month, the total had reached 9 babies, then 12, then 15. Each operation was more dangerous than the last. but Maria had refined her method. She knew the guards' schedules by heart now. She knew which nurses could be trusted and which ones couldn't. She knew the exact weight of a basket that wouldn't draw suspicion and the exact time when the back entrance was least watched. In total, there were 17 operations, each one carrying the risk of immediate death. Maria never spoke about what she was doing. She never asked for help beyond what Elsa could quietly provide. She simply moved through the center like a ghost, invisible and untouchable, driven by something stronger than fear. On the 16th baby, she almost stopped. The child, a tiny girl, almost suffocated beneath the blankets. Maria had packed them too tightly, and when she lifted the basket outside, she realized the baby wasn't breathing. Panic flooded her body. She tore the rolls away, pulled the blanket back, and gently shook the child. The baby gasped, coughed, and began to cry softly. Maria held her for a moment, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." But the next day, a new list appeared. Another round of names, another group of infants marked for relocation. Maria read the list and made her decision. She would continue. One of the younger soldiers noticed the strange weight of an empty basket. His name was Rottenführer Hans Brenner, a 22-year-old from Bavaria who had been assigned to the Lebensborn Center only 3 months earlier. He was less hardened than the older guards, still observant in ways that routine hadn't yet dulled. He had been standing near the kitchen entrance one afternoon when Maria walked past him carrying a basket that should have been empty. She had just delivered bread to the dining hall, but something about the way she held it caught his attention. The basket sagged slightly in the middle, as if it still contained weight. Brenner frowned and watched her walk down the hallway. She moved carefully, her steps measured, her shoulders tense. It was subtle, but it was there. He said nothing at the time, but the observation stayed with him. 2 days later, he mentioned it casually to his superior officer during a smoke break. "Sir, I noticed something odd with one of the kitchen staff, the cook Maria. She was carrying an empty basket, but it looked heavy." The officer, Obersturmführer Georg Weiss, looked at him with mild interest. "Heavy how?" "I don't know, just not empty." Weiss considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Watch her. Don't approach, just observe." From that point on, Brenner began tracking Maria's movements. He noted the times she left the kitchen, the routes she took, the baskets she carried. He didn't understand what he was looking for, but he followed orders. And within a week, he noticed a pattern. Every few days, Maria would leave through the back entrance during the shift change, always carrying a bread basket, always moving with the same careful precision. Weiss took the information to Hauptsturmführer Koch, the center's commander. Koch listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Weiss finished, Koch leaned back in his chair and said, "You think a middle-aged cook is responsible for the missing infants? I think it's worth investigating, sir." Koch nodded slowly. "Then investigate, but do it quietly. I don't want panic, I don't want rumors, and I certainly don't want this reaching Berlin before we have proof." He ordered a silent surveillance operation over the kitchen. Brenner and another guard, a cold-eyed man named Scharführer Otto Lang, were assigned to follow Maria without her knowledge. They were to observe, document, and report, but not intervene. Not yet. Maria had no idea she was being watched. She continued her work with the same discipline as always, preparing meals, baking bread, moving through the center like a shadow. But the 17th baby was coming. Elsa had warned her the night before. A boy, barely a week old, scheduled for transfer the following morning. Maria knew this would be the last one. She could feel the walls closing in, even if she couldn't see them yet. She prepared the basket in the early hours of the morning, lining it with the woolen blanket, tucking the cloth diapers beneath the folds. She moved through the nursery with practiced efficiency, lifting the baby from his crib and wrapping him tightly. He was warm and quiet, his tiny fist curled against his chest. She placed him in the basket, covered him with rolls, and walked toward the back entrance. Brenner and Lang were waiting in the shadows near the service road. They had positioned themselves behind the storage shed, out of sight, but with a clear view of the path Maria would take. When she stepped outside, they saw everything. The careful way she balanced the basket, the quick glance over her shoulder, the deliberate pace of her walk. They followed her at a distance, moving silently through the trees. Maria reached the church and climbed the steps. She set the basket down gently, knocked 3 times on the red door, and turned to leave. That's when 2 men stepped out from the darkness and blocked her path. Maria froze, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at their faces, young, hard, expressionless, and knew immediately that it was over. She didn't run, she didn't scream. She simply stood there, her hands trembling at her sides. Brenner stepped forward and gestured to the basket. "Open it." Maria shook her head slowly. "Please," she whispered. "Please just let him go. Take me, do whatever you want, but let the child go." Lang moved past her and lifted the blanket. The baby stirred, blinking up at the sudden light. Lang's face remained cold. He picked up the basket without a word and turned back toward the center. Maria fell to her knees on the church steps. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply looked up at Brenner and said quietly, "I only wanted to save them." Brenner said nothing. He pulled her to her feet and led her back down the path. The baby was taken from her arms and returned to the nursery. Maria was brought before Hauptsturmführer Koch in his office. He sat behind his desk, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He studied her for a long time before speaking. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. Maria nodded. "Yes. Do you understand the consequences?" "Yes." Koch leaned forward. "You will be transferred to a labor camp. You will not return, and you will never speak of this again. Do you understand?" "Yes." The order was clear. Silence. No scandal, no publicity, nothing that could damage the reputation of the Lebensborn program or suggest that the system had been compromised. Maria was removed from the center that same night. She was placed in a transport truck with no windows, no explanation, and no mercy. She was never seen again. Oberscharführer Reinhardt, the man who had made the bet, was informed of the situation in private. Koch handed him a folder containing the evidence, dates, times, witness reports. Reinhardt read it in silence, his face darkening with each page. When he finished, he stood and walked to the fireplace in Koch's office. Without a word, he threw the folder into the flames and watched it burn. He never spoke of the bet again. The $500 were never mentioned. The story was buried. But a priest in Linz, Father Anton Gruber, had been keeping records. He wrote down Maria's name in a small leather journal, along with the names and approximate ages of the 17 babies who had appeared on his church steps over the course of 2 months. He hid the journal in the basement of the church, beneath a loose stone near the altar, and there it remained forgotten for nearly 50 years. In 1991, one of the babies, now an adult, discovered his origin through a convent diary. His name was Thomas Adler, and he was 48 years old. He lived in Salzburg, worked as an architect, and had always known he was adopted. His parents had told him only that he had been found at a church in Linz in 1943, wrapped in a blanket, with no papers and no explanation. They loved him deeply, raised him well, and never hid the truth from him. But they had no answers about where he came from or who had left him there. Thomas had dark eyes and fair skin, features that didn't quite match the story he'd been told about being abandoned during the chaos of war, and he had a memory, or perhaps it was just a feeling, that he could never explain. Whenever he saw wicker baskets, especially bread baskets, he felt an inexplicable sense of comfort. As a child, he would sit near them in bakeries, running his hands along the woven edges. His adoptive mother thought it was strange. His wife found it endearing. But Thomas never understood it. Then, in the spring of 1991, he received a letter. It came from a nun named Sister Margaret, who had worked at a convent in Linz during the 1940s. She was elderly now, living in a care home in Vienna, and had been sorting through old records when she found a diary entry that mentioned his name. The entry was brief, written in faded ink. Thomas, male infant, approximately 1 week old, received April 1943. Placed with Adler family, Salzburg. But there was something else. Attached to the diary entry was a small note, written by a priest named Father Anton Gruber. It simply said, 17 in total, all saved by one woman, Maria. Thomas stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't understand what it meant, but he knew it was important. He traveled to Vienna to meet Sister Margaret. She was frail, her hands shaking as she handed him the original diary. "I don't know the full story," she told him quietly, but Father Gruber kept this hidden for decades. He said it was too dangerous to speak of it during the war. And after the war, no one wanted to remember. Thomas read the diary carefully. There were 17 entries, each one documenting the arrival of a baby at the church between March and May of 1943. No names for most of them. Just descriptions: male, female, approximate age, physical features. And at the bottom of the page, in Father Gruber's handwriting, a single sentence: "God bless Maria Kohler, who gave everything." Thomas began searching. He hired a researcher, contacted archives, and reached out to adoption agencies across Austria. With the help of church records and testimonies from elderly nuns who still remembered that period, he located 6 other survivors over the next 2 years. 6 people scattered across Austria and Germany who had all been left at churches in the Linz area during the same 2-month window in 1943. They met for the first time in 1993 in a small cafe in Linz. There was Anna, a schoolteacher from Graz; Friedrich, a retired engineer from Munich; Clara, a nurse from Innsbruck; Joachim, a bookshop owner from Linz; Liesel, a seamstress from Vienna; and Matthias, a mechanic from Salzburg. They were strangers, but they shared a common origin that none of them had fully understood until now. Anna brought documents from the convent where she had been raised. Friedrich had a blanket, woolen, faded but still intact, that had been wrapped around him when he was found. Clara had a letter from a nun who had written, years later, that she had always wondered about the bread basket babies. That phrase stuck with all of them. The story began to take shape. With the help of a local historian named Dr. Edward Hartmann, they pieced together what had happened. The LEBENSBORN Center in Linz, the systematic separation of mothers and children, the rigid control, the impossibility of escape. And then Maria, a cook, a widow, a woman no one had noticed, who had risked everything. Dr. Hartmann found records showing that a woman named Maria Kohler had worked at the LEBENSBORN Center and had been transferred to a labor camp in May 1943. There was no record of her after that. No death certificate, no release papers, nothing. She had simply vanished into the system, like so many others. In 2003, Dr. Hartmann released a documentary titled The Bread Basket Babies. It told the story of Maria and the 17 children she had saved. It included interviews with the survivors, historical footage of the Lebensborn program, and testimony from a former nurse named Elsa, who had helped Maria and had lived in silence for 50 years, terrified of speaking out. The documentary also revealed the bet. Through archived letters and testimony from a former SS officer who had been at the center, the filmmakers confirmed that Oberscharführer Klaus Reinhardt had wagered $500 that no baby would ever escape. The bet had been a joke to him, a display of arrogance. But Maria had won, and the humiliation of that loss had been so complete that Reinhardt had destroyed every record of it. The church in Linz, now a memorial site, constructed a simple plaque in Maria's honor. It was placed near the entrance beside the red door where she had knocked 17 times. The inscription read, "To the woman who defeated $500 with bread and courage, Maria Kohler, 1900-1943. She saved 17 lives and asked for nothing in return." One of the survivors, Joachim, wrote in the memorial guest book, "If she had failed, I would not be here. My children would not be here. My grandchildren would not be here. She gave us everything and we never even knew her name." In 2005, the museum that now occupies the site of the former Lebensborn Center opened a permanent exhibition. Among the displays, photographs, documents, personal testimonies, there is a single object in a glass case. It is a wicker bread basket, old and worn, with a faded woolen blanket folded inside. The plaque beside it reads, "This basket represents the 17 lives saved by Maria Kohler between March and May 1943. It is empty now, but it once held the future. Visitors stop in front of it every day. Some cry, some stand in silence, some place their hands on the glass, as if trying to touch something sacred." And in Salzburg, Thomas Adler, now 79 years old, still keeps a bread basket in his kitchen. He doesn't use it for bread, he just keeps it there on the counter, where he can see it every morning. When his grandchildren ask why, he tells them the story. And he always ends the same way: "Because someone I never met loved me enough to risk her life, and I will never forget that."